והנואם הבא הוא השגריר החדש של ארצות הברית בישראל, דניאל שפירו, שמלווה אותנו בעצם מגיל 4, לא של המדינה, שלו, וחי איתנו כמה שנים טובות כסטודנט וכילד וכסטודנט, וחוזר אלינו כשגריר. אני חושב שאלתי אותו במהלך הרצאתך כמה הוא מבין, אם מותר לי לספר את זה. אז הוא אמר לי 75%, אז חשבתי לעצמי, כמעט כמוני. אז אבל המגבלות שלו הן אחרות, שלי הן לא לשוניות שלו. אז אני מודה לך שזאת אחת ההרצאות הראשונות. אני יודע שזאת לא הראשונה בישראל, כי את הראשונה נדמה לי שאני שמעתי, אם היא הייתה הראשונה אז אני שמעתי אותה בירושלים. אבל אני מודה לך שזאת אחת ההרצאות הראשונות שאתה נושא בפני ציבור ישראלי, ואני מניח שזה לא יהיה בעברית, אבל זה בסדר, כל הקהל כאן מבין גם את השפה האנגלית. ואני חושב שזה מאוד חשוב שאתה מופיע בפני הציבור הישראלי, כי זה, אני חושב שאין מספיק, כמישהו שבא מתחום הדיפלומטיה בעצמי, אני חושב שאין מספיק דיפלומטיה ציבורית, כלומר שלא מדברים מספיק אל הקהלים ואל הציבורים בנושאים שעומדים ברומו של עולם. היום זה נושא אחר, הוא גם כן עומד, גם הוא עומד ברומו של עולם, וזה, אמנם הערב הזה הוא על לזכרו של זאב שיף, שהיה בבורד של המכון, אבל חשבנו גם שאפשר לנצל את ההזדמנות ולהזכיר את האירוע הנורא של ספטמבר 2001, וזה עשור, ולכן אני חושב ואני מודה שהסכמת לבוא, והמיקרופון שלך.
תודה עודד, וכמו שעודד הסביר, אני כן אנאם באנגלית, אבל ברשותכם אגיד כמה מילים בעברית בהתחלה. אנחנו נכנסים, כמו שאמרת, לימים כשנזכור את ההתקפות של 11 לספטמבר. אז מתאים שאני אצטרף לכינוס הזה. בוודאי אנחנו נזכור כל מי שאיבדנו ביום הנורא הזה. זה די עצוב. אבל המוקד שלנו בימים האלו יהיה לא להסתכל אחורה, אלא קדימה, ולהמשיך הלאה, ולחיות ולבנות חברה יותר חזקה ויותר בטוחה, להגן על אזרחינו, וגם לבנות חברה יותר פתוחה ודמוקרטית. ובכל זאת, בשבילי זאת זכות גדולה לזכור את היום הזה פה, כאן בארץ, איתכם, כי לדעתי אין עם בכל העולם שיבינו את ההרגשות שלנו, של האמריקאים, כעת יותר מעם ישראל, הידידים הטובים שלנו, שגם סבלו מהתקפות כאלו. אז רק רציתי להגיד עם המחשבות האלו, ועכשיו אני אחליף לאנגלית.
Thank you, Oded.
for the opportunity to address the symposium. I want to really express my appreciation to the Institute for National Security Studies. This is an organization that I and many of my colleagues in the U.S. government deeply admire for stimulating dialogue and for challenging assumptions on security issues. It's a privilege to be here as well with the Schiff family to help remember and honor the life and work of Zev Schiff, Zichrono Livracha, by continuing to do what he did best, which was stimulate dialogue. I did not have the privilege of a close relationship with Zev Schiff. We met briefly only a handful of times. But like all of those seeking to understand the security challenges in Israel and the Middle East, I was his faithful reader and devoted student. In 3 days, we will mark the 10th anniversary of the September 11th attacks. On that day, 10 years ago, 2,977 innocent people were killed in vicious and coordinated attacks at the World Trade Center and at the Pentagon and the downing of United Flight 93. These were attacks against the United States and the American people. But in the international city that is New York, hundreds of citizens of other countries died alongside the American victims that day. And among those killed were 5 Israelis: Alona Avraham, Leon Lebor, Shai Levinhar, Daniel Lewin, and Chagai Shefi. I think it's appropriate to pause for a moment of silence in the memory of all of these victims and the many other victims of terrorism around the world. Thank you. I was asked to speak today about how the United States was changed by the attacks of 9/11, and I will focus on the changes in our counterterrorism policies and strategies. But for my generation of foreign policy and national security professionals, this searing memory of the terrible losses we suffered that day is the driving force in our work to make America and the world safer and to prevent the recurrence of any such terrible attacks. I will focus on some of the way our counterterrorism efforts have evolved in the past decade, and I'll talk about 4 specific areas: international partnerships, counterterrorism operations, intelligence, and homeland security. And in each case, in this audience, it's appropriate that I highlight some particular U.S.-Israel successes. A key element of our post-9/11 posture is our partnership with critical allies worldwide. Prior to 9/11, our international counterterrorism cooperation was episodic rather than sustained and conducted primarily bilaterally with a few close partners. But terrorism, as we all know, is a threat that respects no borders and as such requires a comprehensive multilateral international response. And over the past 10 years, we found countless ways of improving coordination with governments around the world on issues as diverse as terrorist financing, the sharing of intelligence information, extradition of suspected terrorists, container security, and cybersecurity, just to name a few. We've built close ties between key counterterrorism elements of our government and their counterparts on every continent, most of which had rarely been in regular contact with each other before. And in countries with less capacity, we are working to make the counterterrorism training of police, prosecutors, border officials, and members of the judiciary more systematic, more innovative, and more far-reaching. Our entire government works in this effort. The Departments of State, Justice, Defense, and others across the U.S. government have dozens of programs which can be found, as I said, on every continent in literally dozens of countries, working tirelessly to help train and equip friendly governments around the world to help address state weaknesses that terrorism thrives on. And our partnerships involve officials from the working level all the way to the very top. This is a main subject of many of our most senior officials, including the President and the Secretary of State's conversations with their counterparts. Governments are joining together time and again in preventing real attacks in real time, including ones planned against planes crossing the Atlantic and on public transport systems worldwide. I'm proud that under the Obama administration, our security relationship with Israel is also among those that is broader and deeper and more intense than ever before. And we know that many of the threats that the United faces are threats to Israel And it's equally true that many of the threats that face Israel, America faces as well. So this is a partnership that ensures that in the face of terrorism, both of our countries are stronger and our citizens are safer. Over the past 2.5 years, we've undertaken an unprecedented reinvigoration of bilateral defense consultations through nearly continuous high-level discussions and visits. The United States and Israel share security dialogues and exchanges in political, military, and intelligence channels to discuss regional security matters and counterterrorism, sharing information that can and does save lives. We've re-energized structured dialogues, such as the U.S.-Israel Joint Political Military Group and the Defense Policy Advisory Group, to name a few. And in these dialogues, but more importantly than the structured dialogues, in countless day-to-day contacts between the security-related officials of both countries, ranging from, we discuss a wide range of current security concerns, ranging from procurement to counterterrorism to homeland security techniques to regional developments, and provide an opportunity for our governments to share perspectives on policies, address mutual concerns, explain threat perceptions, and identify new areas for cooperation. We share information on Hamas weapons smuggling, Hezbollah's arsenal, the movement of al-Qaeda operatives, terrorist financing networks, and the state sponsorship of terrorism by Syria and Iran. We develop and execute joint strategies to counter these threats and jointly approach other governments to enlist their support. In addition, we continue to work on innovative technology to combat the threat and reality of terrorism. We need to ensure that we are using science and technology to our best advantage to defeat them. And that's why, in addition to the over $3 billion in military assistance that the United States will provide Israel in the coming fiscal year, we also continue to work closely on the development of innovative technology, particularly, but not only, in the area of missile defense. As everyone here knows, we've worked closely together on the Arrow system for long-range missiles, and we're developing the David Sling system jointly for mid-range. But as you also know, Congress, at the request of President Obama, provided $205 million to accelerate production and deployment of the Iron Dome short-range missile defense system. This is a project to which I devoted particular attention during my tenure at the White House. The recent rocket attacks in southern Israel were a stark reminder of why the U.S.-Israel partnership is so crucial. Let me put it as simply as I can. Iron Dome saves lives. It also provides the Israeli government with more time and greater flexibility in determining how to respond to terrorist missile strikes. So close international defense and counterterror partnerships is one reality in the post-9/11 environment. Another is the overhaul of the way we conduct counterterror operations at home and abroad. And the close U.S.-Israel relationship proved invaluable to American officials aiming to establish the most efficient and reliable counterterrorism posture. In the years since the September 11th attacks, American leaders and citizens have struggled to balance civil liberties with the needs of secure communities, personal privacy with the need for accurate intelligence, combat operational needs with the demands of a thorough criminal investigation. Security posture is always a work in progress, and our ultimate goal is to make sure we maintain that balance while recognizing the freedoms inherent in our societies. As we begin restructuring our government, the U.S. turned to a valued and trusted, as we began restructuring our government, the U.S. turned to a valued and trusted partner. We turned to Israel, a country that has lived under the threat of terror for far too long and had lessons it was willing to share. And indeed, INSS's own former chairman, Uzi Dayan, was a major source of counsel and advice to U.S. officials and security specialists at the time. The lessons we learned from Israel and applied to an American context broadly fall into three categories: intelligence, operations, and homeland security. In the area of intelligence, the United States in 2001 was still oriented in a post-Cold War mindset. We were reducing resources dedicated to Cold War threats, while we had identified and acknowledged the new threats of transnational terrorism and proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, among others. We were not set organizationally to address them. We had overemphasized systems that could spot large pieces of military equipment, but put far too little emphasis on the key role of human intelligence, something Israel is legendary for. We also learned that the competition between domestic and foreign intelligence operations can open gaps which terrorists can exploit. So we undertook to streamline communication between intelligence communities. Israel does this as part of its security culture and out of operational necessity. But for the U.S., we needed organizational and leadership solutions. So we established the National Counterterrorism Center in order to ensure case information is shared between organizations so we don't miss important connections that can be used to prevent attacks. and we integrated the intelligence community through the creation of a national director of intelligence, whose job is to connect the dots and ensure we have not overlooked important connections in our analysis of raw intelligence due to a bureaucratic limitation. Israel offered operational lessons as well. We learned it was necessary to disrupt across the entire terrorist enterprise, from recruitment to indoctrination, training, financing, logistical support, and ultimately to the point of attack. Targeting elements at these different stages requires a range of intelligence resources, identifying and seizing financial assets, engagement with societies to discredit violent and extreme elements, and the application of special operations forces. These lessons were passed through strengthened partnerships between the U.S. and Israel defense and intelligence agencies. And this cooperation takes many forms, but I'm especially proud and really want to highlight the exchanges and joint training that go on really very beneath the radar screen of our elite special operations unit. One of the most challenging overhauls we undertook was in the area of homeland security. Following the attacks of September 11th and the anthrax attacks using the U.S. Postal Service, we set out to change how we were organized to prevent attacks and respond to threats. We established the Department of Homeland Security, which took the functions of over 40 separate federal agencies and gave them one address. Organizations like the Coast Guard, the Secret Service, the Customs Service, the Immigration and Naturalization Service, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and the Transportation Security Agency all folded into this new organization we call DHS. The creation of DHS was an effort to match the challenging demand of securing the United States and its interests by better linking those needs with existing officers and personnel with diverse but interrelated responsibilities. Among its first tasks, done in partnership with the Department of State, was to secure the U.S. border by tracking entries and exits, securing travel documents, providing adequate security screening at airports and cargo facilities, enhancing physical security along our long land and sea borders, and engaging with international partners to help us do all of this. Again, we turn to Israel. In aviation security, for example, El Al and Israeli aviation experts offered us their hard-learned lessons from earlier acts of terrorism. Israel, despite the threats it faces, has built an effective system to prevent acts of aviation terrorism. That is why, earlier this year, Secretary of Homeland Security Janet Napolitano came to Israel to examine security procedures at Ben Gurion Airport. We have had similar exchanges by local law enforcement, who are oftentimes at the forefront of our counterterrorism efforts. U.S., local, and state officials regularly travel to Israel to learn firsthand how Israel addresses the threat of terrorism in its communities. All the areas I've touched on, international partnerships, intelligence, and organization, have made our counterterrorism strategy more effective. But probably the most important qualities of successful counterterrorism efforts, which we and Israel share, are relentlessness and dedication. Terrorists bent on killing civilians and wreaking havoc in our societies do not give up. So we must be even more determined than they are and pursue them to the end. And that is what the United States did on May 1st of this year, when President Obama ordered and our skillful special forces successfully carried out the operation that found and killed Osama bin Laden. Because of our efforts prior to that day, he had become a shadow of a man, locked in a box, stripped of much of his organization. But despite his defeats, he remained a man who was continuing to plan attacks and advocate violence against the United States and around the world. And bringing him to justice closed an important chapter for the American people. Even as it took 10 long years to get Osama bin Laden, the threat of terrorism that we felt so intensely has in fact receded for many Americans. This was a vision described by then Prime Minister Ariel Sharon on the first anniversary of the 9/11 attacks, when he said, quote, "We stand by America as it struggles to make life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness once again self-evident for all of us." So we've adjusted to our new security focus, and life has returned to normality for the vast majority of Americans. Of course, for Israel, the threat of terrorists striking at home remains constant, as we were reminded on August 18th when terrorists attempted to take hostages along Israel's border with Egypt. My wife, Julie, and I, with heavy hearts, attended the funeral of Staff Sergeant Moshe Naftali at Mount Herzl, and I later attended the funeral of Chief Warrant Officer Pascal Avrahami of the Yamam Special Police Unit. They were security officers called to respond to the terror attack, a soldier and a police officer doing their duty to protect their fellow citizens. They were among the many killed and injured that day and in the following days of rocket and mortar fire from the Gaza Strip. On August 23rd, I saw the damage and threat posed by those strikes when I visited with victims of rocket attacks at the Kaplan Medical Center in Rehovot, and then went on to view sites in Ashdod city center struck by rockets and witnessed the severe damage those weapons can do in a civilian area. These experiences, so early in my tenure as U.S. Ambassador to Israel, drove home for me the essential nature of continuing and deepening our counterterrorism partnership. Our efforts must and will continue to evolve to meet new challenges, and our partnerships across the world will continue to deepen. Today, we are stronger than we were on 9/11, but there are no guarantees in this world. What we can do is maximize our ability to prevent an attack from occurring, minimize the ability of such an attack having a large impact, and increasing our ability to respond. On behalf of President Obama and the American people, let me offer my deep appreciation for the close partnership between our two countries in meeting threats and combating terror. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Shapiro. We would be happy to host you again in other more cheerful circumstances.